Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932 and dropped this now famous line during his inaugural speech.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Pretty good advice, because during the Roosevelt administration, people generally believed there was plenty to be afraid of. There was the continued economic crisis of the Great Depression, and there was a guy named Hitler over in Europe who was definitely scary. The only thing people weren't afraid of during the period from 1932 to 1945 was the task of remembering the name of a new president, because it was always Roosevelt. He was our longest-serving president, elected 4 times. Some say he was the closest we ever had to a king, and honestly, FDR had about as much money as some kings. Despite his wealth, Roosevelt's own personal hardships helped him understand the hardships of regular Americans.
He had had polio, and it had crippled his legs. He could not walk without assistance. When he walked, he would have to lock the steel braces on both of his legs so that they would be rigid, and then someone would take him by the arm. But the public was not really aware that he was a cripple, because the news media entered into a conspiracy of silence.
It was said, in fact, in the 30s that it took a man on crutches to teach a crippled nation how to walk again.
For America to walk again, 10 million Americans needed to get back to work.
Franklin D. Roosevelt came to office at a terrible time in America where 1 out of 4 people who wanted jobs and needed jobs could not find jobs. A lot of parents had children who were going hungry, and Franklin D. Roosevelt decided that the only way to get the economy going again was for the government to spend a lot of money and even go into deficits, up to a point where people could get their jobs back again.
Roosevelt launched the New Deal, which created programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and massive public works projects designed to provide jobs for Americans. It was kind of like a massive chore list for the American public in exchange for an allowance. To sell his ideas to the public, FDR embraced the new technology of the day and aired radio broadcasts that he called fireside chats. Today, he'd probably do a podcast.
Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat was very simply the forerunner of every presidential address that we see today. But it was a radical break, taking advantage of the latest technology. Radio was coming into its own. Franklin Roosevelt became the first president to really effectively use radio. His signature opening was, "My friends," and they believed him.
And FDR used the radio to help people understand his policy decisions.
He closed down the banks for a couple of days and then helped explain to people how the banks worked, how they shouldn't pull all their money out of it, and he inspired confidence.
Though the New Deal provided a financial safety net for many Americans, some felt that Roosevelt was exercising too much power as president and spending too much of America's money. Another strain on America's finances was the war overseas, which landed on America's shores at Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
FDR had to shift focus away from the economic hard times to begin the task of being a war president.
Franklin Roosevelt led America to prepare for war. The draft was reinstated. The armed forces were building even before Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And then afterwards, Roosevelt, working with his ally in Britain, Winston Churchill, helped bring out the success and the strength of America. It was the end of the Depression. It was an incredible expansion of America's industrial capacity.
Unfortunately, while fighting for freedom abroad, Roosevelt severely restricted the freedoms of Japanese Americans at home.
Franklin Roosevelt is lionized for winning World War II, but he's also criticized for putting 110,000 Japanese Americans in what were in effect concentration camps.
Roosevelt has also been criticized for not doing more to stop the systematic murder of the Jews during the Holocaust.
He said the only way to help the Jews was to defeat Germany on the battlefield. This policy was called rescue through victory. Jewish organizations worried, however, that if rescue was postponed until the day of Allied victory, there might not be any Jews left alive to save.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our longest-serving president, lived to see the end of the Depression, but missed the official end of World War II by just a few months. The Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, but FDR had died in office 4 months earlier. Fortunately, though, he had already checked off most of the items on his presidential chore list.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Here was this aristocrat from Dutchess County, confined to a wheelchair, Harvard educated, but because of his almost innate sense of communication skills and the medium of radio, he was transported into the living rooms of almost every home in America. And in our household, FDR was a demigod. He was the voice that always gave them hope. My parents really worshiped FDR. And it was not just because of policies. They felt connected to him because of that great warm radio voice and that amazing ability that he had to speak directly to the fears and the hopes of the American people.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal was an amazing time because FDR was about establishing hope, trying to bring hope back to life for a people that caught in this unbelievably chaotic period of economic chaos and stress.
In a lot of ways, FDR was actually an extremely unlikely figure to become a sort of moral and visionary leader in the ways that he did. Now, I think there's a great myth of FDR that he came into office, the country rallied around him, and the Depression was eventually solved. Now, that's not true. FDR was hated passionately by large portions of the population, and yet he did something really significant in those first months. First of all, he acted, and he acted in significant ways, and he came in saying, we can whip this thing, and whether or not he quite did it in those first months, he brought dramatic new ideas to the table and really did upend a lot of assumptions and make the idea that change really was possible a reality in many ways.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Anytime we examine the New Deal, the legislation that FDR initiated as swiftly as he took the oath of office, you have to put it in the context of what had come before. We'd had a run of Republican pro-business presidents of the United States. Herbert Hoover was one of them, Cal Coolidge was another one, obviously. FDR came along and determined that something much bolder was needed to save the country, to provide a kind of a lifeboat, if you will, legislatively. So the New Deal was a real upheaval of everything that had gone before. And interestingly, the Republicans in Congress were willing to go along because the country was in such desperate shape. The idea of Social Security or public works programs, the WPA, the various other agricultural programs, which became critically important to the restoration of American agriculture and the modernization of it. The Republicans were willing to try anything at that point because we were on the precipice. The entire country could have gone down, and almost did, from an economic point of view.
On Inauguration Day, the new president offered hope to a desperate people.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
He had promised Americans a New Deal. Now he began to construct it.
On his first full day in office, FDR confronted his greatest challenge, the banking crisis that threatened to destroy America's economy. Roosevelt began with a decisive act, declaring a bank holiday. He temporarily closed all the nation's banks. Then, he called Congress into special session to pass emergency banking legislation to protect bank depositors and curb risky banking practices.
Treasury officials feverishly began work on the Emergency Banking Act. Rushed to Congress 4 days later, it was approved within hours. The act gave the government authority to examine bank finances, provide needed capital, and determine which banks were fit to reopen. The healthy banks were authorized to reopen on March 13th, the night before FDR went on nationwide radio to reassure Americans. His appeal worked.
The following morning, when the banks reopened, depositors lined up to return their money. The banking crisis was over.
We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friend. Your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail. It is 3 months, my friend, since I have talked to the people of this country about our national problem. My friend, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. That, my friends, must be the new spirit of the American future. My friend, 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 my friend.
FDR forged a powerful bond with Americans by communicating with them in ways no previous president had.
His freewheeling press conferences, eventually totaling almost 1,000, attracted attention. But Roosevelt's greatest communication tool was radio.
During his first days in office, FDR needed to calm the fears of an anxious nation and begin to explain his program for economic recovery.
The bank will take care of all needs.
To do this, he used the greatest mass communication device of the 1930s, the radio.
This new invention revolutionized politics during the 1920s and 1930s. For the first time, millions could hear the live voices of national leaders.
FDR was a master of radio, using it to bypass the Congress and the press and speak directly to the American people in their homes and workplaces.
Days after entering office, he began an innovative series of radio addresses that reporters labeled fireside chats, speaking calmly and conversationally as if he were actually sitting in the listener's living room.
Thousands responded with letters. White House mail jumped from 5,000 letters a week to 50,000.
I thank you for your faith. Our troubles will not be over tomorrow, but we are on our way, and we are headed in the right direction.
Let's say the United States has just plunged into the worst depression in its history and you are the president of those same United States. What do you do? Well, if your name is Herbert Hoover, then you would say something about laissez-faire individualism and do nothing. But if your name's Herbert Hoover, then you're also going to be remembered for being wrong. So let's skip ahead a few years and say now you're Franklin Roosevelt. You have a much better idea, which you call the New Deal. This program ran from 1933 to 35 and broke down into 3 goals: relief, recovery, and reform. It all started with what became known as the first 100 days, during which Congress passed an unprecedented amount of legislation. First up was a banking holiday. For 2 days, every bank across the country was shut down and investigated. The well-behaved banks were then allowed to reopen while the rest were put under government control. The government then put some broad restrictions over the banks while also creating the FDIC, which would act as insurance for banking deposits. These 2 measures were designed to restore Americans' confidence in the banking system. Also aimed at restoring confidence were FDR's fireside chats, in which he spoke weekly to the American people through the radio in a reassuring voice and told them what was going on. More practical was the so-called alphabet soup of new government agencies that sprang up. In no particular order, there was the Public Works Administration, which paid people to rebuild roads, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which paid younger people to plant trees, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built hydroelectric dams in Tennessee, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which helped farmers by paying them to not farm, and the National Recovery Administration, which placed productive regulation on industry, just to name a few. But as it turned out, all that wasn't enough. Roosevelt then launched the Second New Deal, which ran from 1935 to 1938. It was basically more of the same, adding the Works Progress Administration for artists and the Social Security Act for old and out-of-work people to the alphabet soup. So, did it work? In a word, kinda. FDR did greatly expand the role of the federal government in people's lives and likely saved the economy from getting much worse. But government spending is a complicated thing. For all the good the New Deal may have done, 1937 and 38 still saw the Roosevelt recession when FDR tried to cut back on spending just a little. And even on his best day, FDR never got unemployment below 16%. That is, until World War II.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work.
When FDR took office, 1 out of 4 workers was without a job. Another 1 in 4 could only find part-time work. He moved immediately to put people back to work by launching the largest public works program in American history, directing billions of federal dollars to fund work relief for the unemployed.
His goal was to provide immediate assistance to the unemployed and to increase their purchasing power so they could buy more goods and services and help boost the nation's economy. From 1933 to 1935, FDR created new agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men ages 17 to 24, many from urban areas, to work on conservation projects in healthy rural environments. During its 9-year existence, the CCC employed nearly 3 million men. They planted over 2 billion trees, fought forest fires, built trails, campgrounds, and reservoirs, and aided with soil conservation programs. It became one of the New Deal's most popular and successful programs. Its legacy remains today in facilities it constructed throughout America's national forests and parks.
The Public Works Administration, PWA, contracted with private construction companies to put additional people to work, while the Works Progress Administration, WPA, hired the unemployed directly. It was the largest public works initiative in American history, employing 3.3 million people at its height. WPA workers built thousands of roads, bridges, tunnels, parks, airports, schools, courthouses, post offices, and other public buildings. Agency artists created nearly 500,000 works of public art and brought theater, literature, oral histories, music, and dance to communities around the nation. Together, these agencies helped millions of families survive during the bleakest years of the Great Depression.
This is a great national crusade, a crusade to destroy enforced idleness, which is an enemy of the human spirit generated by this depression.
To save the New Deal, Roosevelt proposed a radical piece of legislation, a bill to give him the power to appoint additional justices to the Supreme Court and outnumber his opponents. On Capitol Hill, critics argued that Roosevelt's bill challenged the Constitution itself.
I shall not be a party to breaking down the checks and balances of the Constitution.
A packed jury, a packed court, and a stuffed ballot box are all on the same moral plane. This is more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have.
This is a nonpartisan battle to preserve an independent Supreme Court.
Determined to win votes for his court plan, Roosevelt was now in the congressional fight of his life. He dangled promises of federal projects, hinted at judicial appointments, threatened to withdraw patronage. At a picnic for Democratic congressmen, he turned on all his charm. This time, it didn't work. On July 20th, he asked his vice president, Jack Garner, what his chances were with Congress. "Do you want it with the bark on or off, Captain?" Garner replied. The rough way. "All right, you're beat. You haven't got the votes."
And the price that he paid was very high. It was a loss of confidence on the part of the country. It was a recognition by his opponents in politics that they could beat him. It was a recognition on his part that he had lost some measure of power.
Once again, the criminal was definitely a product of the times. The Depression sent homeless men wandering through the country on freight trains. The panic was on, and the public enemy number one was born. He worked differently from the old mobs, using weapons like these, and these were all taken from killed or captured desperados. He robbed and pillaged the countryside. For a few $100 loot, he thought nothing of killing some innocent bank teller or other accidental bystander. Local police couldn't cope with these boys, so J. Edgar Hoover and his G-men moved into action. They faced a long list of desperate killers like Pretty Boy Floyd. The wrath was focused on this Oklahoma band after he had personally accounted for the deaths of 4 federal officers in the bloody Kansas City Station massacre. When finally killed by the FBI in a little town in Ohio, there were 10 notches in his pocket watch, one for each of his killings. His buddy, Adam Richetti, was later executed for his part in the murders. After Floyd, the FBI set full sail after a kill-crazy gunman named Babyface Nelson. When cornered after a 70-mile-an-hour auto chase in Barrington, Illinois, he killed 2 G-men before winding up dead himself in front of this lonely cemetery. His body was riddled with 17 bullets in all. It was the courts who cut short the career of the notorious Doc Barker and his gang. He was the son of the infamous Old Lady of Crime, Ma Barker. Doc is shown here at the time of his conviction for the Bremer kidnapping, later killed in an attempted escape from Alcatraz. And a courtroom marked the end for Machine Gun Kelly, too. He is shown being flown off to prison in chains and under heavily armed guard. These precautions were all too necessary. The police knew Kelly as a dangerous, unpredictable killer, who at the time of his sentencing was still yelling threats of death at the judge who pronounced the verdict.
Thousands attend the homecoming of Clyde Barrow. In this Dallas funeral home, his body lies as a never-ending line of men, women, and children from every walk of life file by his casket for a fleeting glimpse of the boy who had wrought so much death and destruction. Everyone wants to see how such a bad boy looked in death. In life,
over 3 days in May of 1934, throngs of onlookers flocked to 2 Dallas funeral homes, hoping to catch a last glimpse of the outlaws, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker.
My dad said there was just lines and lines of people. They were mobbing the place. They couldn't have a decent funeral because everybody was just crowding around taking souvenirs.
Clyde's body is borne to the grave. He died at the hands of the law.
My grandpa went down to the funeral home to Clyde's viewing. It was probably a little bit of excitement for them. He was only one of thousands.
3 miles across the city from where Clyde's body lay, lies the body of Bonnie Parker, and here the crowd is even greater.
Bonnie and Clyde had been on a 2-year crime spree that left a trail of dead bodies in their wake. They were little more than a local curiosity until photos of the couple were discovered at a crime scene in 1933. Overnight, the country became transfixed by the scandalous images, press accounts of improbable escapes, and their illicit romance.
Bonnie and Clyde, who people are sort of making up stories about or getting sightings of, all of a sudden there are pictures, there are guns, and there's evidence.
It was a non-stop soap opera. Everybody was tuned into the radios, everybody was reading the papers, and actually it was almost like they were rooting them to get away.
Bonnie and Clyde would join the ranks of other celebrity gangsters like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson. So-called public enemies who emerged out of nowhere during the Great Depression to capture the country's imagination.
In a world where there was very little to get excited about in summer 1933, Bonnie and Clyde were pretty big news.
Everybody was talking about the criminals, the bad guys. But Clyde and Bonnie had the one thing the others didn't, the whole true romance and the sexy scandal.
Bonnie and Clyde's notoriety would force them to take even greater risks to remain free and on the open road. As law enforcement's hunt was kicked into overdrive.
There wasn't going to be any arrest or any trial. It was going to be an execution.
Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in the Texas Cotton Belt on March 24, 1909. One of 7 children of itinerant farmers Henry and Cumie Barrow. By 1925, the whole Barrow clan had followed a wave of other farmers who were flooding cities in search of work. With all their worldly possessions packed into a horse-drawn cart, the Barrows settled on the outskirts of Dallas, in an impoverished backwater known as the Devil's Back Porch.
Clyde Barrow grew up in an unincorporated slum, so poverty-stricken we couldn't imagine it today. And there's a campground right on the west bank of the Trinity River, and it's mostly mud, and there's one well, there's a few outhouses, and this is where the indigent lived.
My grandfather and grandmother, they're just poor people trying to survive. And they camped out there in just that wagon, that little mule, and that's how they lived. No money, no food, just poor as you could be.
So from the time this kid can really think, all he knows is there's no hope. This is it. I'm going to be poor, I'm going to be hungry, I'm going to be put down the rest of my life.
Clyde chafed at the prospect of a life of poverty. Though he was slight, 5 feet 6 inches, never more than 130 pounds, Clyde was bright, energetic, and a dreamer. He saw what he wanted just across the river in Dallas, a prosperous city with skyscrapers, endless entertainment, and streets lined with high-end shops. Dallas exposed Clyde to a life that was far beyond his grasp.
He had dreams, he wanted to do something rather than be poor the rest of his life. He hated poverty, and he hated looking like poverty.
With a taste for expensive suits and little interest in honest work, Clyde Barrow picked up the bad habits of his older brother, Buck, who had already settled into a life of petty crime. What started with the 2 brothers stealing chickens quickly grew into armed robbery, and by the time he was 17, Clyde was perfecting his signature crime.
This is the first era of car theft. The electric starter system is put in cars. You could hotwire one. And Buck was a master of it, and he passed the skill along to little brother. Clyde Barrow didn't see stealing so much as a crime as almost an obligation. I want to get out of here. This is the only way I can do it.
By 1929, Clyde's crimes were regularly drawing the attention of local police. In November of that year, Clyde, Buck, and an accomplice broke into an auto shop in the town of Denton, just outside Dallas. Local law enforcement spotted the robbers trying to flee and opened fire.
And they shoot Buck, and they capture Buck. But Clyde runs all the way back home.
It's a close call, but it's worth it. Because as long as he's stealing cars and getting a few dollars for them, he's somebody. And to him, that's worth any risk.
Despite his brush with the law, Clyde's family was happy to have him close to home. And just a few months later, he would meet a young girl from the same side of the tracks who shared his yearning for a better life.
The Great Depression, was a dramatic, worldwide economic calamity which started in 1929 and lasted until the late 30s. Most people believe it began with the U.S. stock market collapse of October 1929. By 1932, U.S. stocks were only worth 20% of what they were prior to the crisis, and 1 year later, almost half of all United States banks had failed. By 1935, roughly 750,000 farms had been lost to bankruptcy or distressed sales. European countries, debilitated by the debt they've accumulated due to World War I, dealt with a severe depression and a sovereign debt crisis ultimately emerged. In Germany, for example, unemployment reached 25%, and among other things, this economic disaster led to Hitler's Nazi Party becoming the top political actor after the 1932 elections. Worldwide trade was devastated by the Great Depression, with countries engaging in so-called trade wars by limiting imports, and by the same year 1932, global trade crashed to half of the pre-crisis volume. Unfortunately, trade wars degenerated into an actual armed conflict, which caused over 60 million deaths. World War II. Make no mistake, most wars have been caused by economic factors to a very large degree. Let's learn from the past and not let this happen again.